Hey everyone, my name is Paul, and today I'm replacing the timing belt and water pump in my 1997 Toyota RAV4. My RAV4 has the 2-liter 3S FE engine, and the timing belt should be replaced every 60,000 miles. Now you can go a bit longer than that, but if the timing belt breaks while you're driving, the engine will stop running and you'll get stranded wherever you happen to be. The good news is, if the timing belt breaks, the piston will not come up and hit the valves, and you won't get any internal engine damage. All you have to do is fix the timing belt and everything will be okay. Now this video is actually part of the previous video where I replaced the cylinder head, but if all you need to do is replace your timing belt, you can save yourself some time by watching this video instead of that one. Let's start by opening the hood. Yeah, that's boring, but check this out. I'm going to open it farther than normal. I'm hooking a motorcycle tie-down strap to the latch, then connecting it to the spare tire. This way the hood won't just slam down when I bump into it. I don't even need the hood prop stick. I only need to lift the right front corner of the RAV4. The lower control arm mount is a good place for the jack stand. Take the right front wheel off using a 21mm socket. We will need access to the front of the engine. I'll be removing one of the engine mounts soon, so now is a good time to support the engine with the jack. Removing the battery will give you more room to reach the timing belt. Take the negative terminal off first. If the wrench touches the body, I won't get a short circuit. Take the positive terminal off second. The battery hold-down bracket also takes a 10mm socket. The front hook will come out, but the rear hook stays. Now I can remove the battery. The battery tray has 4 bolts holding it in. I will definitely be washing this. Next step, remove the alternator. Unplug the connector, then use a 10mm wrench to loosen the power cable. Unclip the harness, then loosen the rear pivot bolt with a 14mm socket. Loosen the front pivot bolt with a 12mm socket, then use a drill to loosen the belt tensioner. Now the belt comes off. Take the front pivot bolt out, then the rear. Now pull the alternator up and toward the front of the car. Don't forget to take the belt off too. Next up is the power steering reservoir. Its function is to dump oil all over your belts. Pull it straight up, then unhook the rear hose. This will make a mess. It's a good idea to put a cap on the reservoir and plug the hose. Pull the U-shaped hose off the solid line in the car and remove the reservoir. Cap the line and clean up the extra fluid. The engine mount is next. If you don't have a jack under the oil pan, add it now. The motor mount has 4 bolts and 1 nut that can be removed from above, and 1 more nut below. Lift it straight up and take it out. The support bracket is hard to take out. Use a shallow 14mm socket to remove the 3 bolts. This part is very annoying to deal with. Now just take it out. Just kidding, it's stuck in there. There's 1 more bolt holding the upper timing cover. Now we can get the cover and the motor mount bracket out. The power steering pump has some of the hardest to reach bolts. Toyota has a special tool for this, but it's not available. This mountain ratcheting wrench is perfect for the job. I used a shallow 14mm socket for the lower 2 bolts on the power steering pump. The upper bolt is very hard to reach. I ended up using a regular box and wrench. I'll go buy the special tool to put it back together. Now that I've loosened 3 bolts, I can push the power steering pump down and take the belt off. The harmonic balancer pulley comes off next. Toyota makes a special holder tool for this too, but if you have an impact wrench, you don't need it. Sometimes you can get the pulley off without any special tools. I was not that lucky. This is a harmonic balancer puller tool. I got it from AutoZone for $26. It comes with several bolts, so it works with different cars. Tighten the holding bolts, then the center bolt will remove the balancer for you. There are 4 more bolts holding the timing cover. The crank position sensor wiring is also clipped into this cover, so you'll need to unclip that. Now we have access to the timing belt. Let's remove it. Start by loosening the timing belt tensioner pulley. Notice it goes back up when I let go. There is a spring keeping tension on the belt. Hold the pulley down and take the belt off. This belt actually looks pretty good. There are no cracks or tears in the belt. I will install a new belt anyway. Replacing the timing belt is a lot of work, so you'll want to take care of any oil leaks behind the belt right now. My oil pump is leaking behind the pulley. My front main seal is not leaking yet. Replacing the complete oil pump assembly requires taking off the crankshaft pulley and oil pan. I'm going to cheat a bit and replace only the seals that are leaking. The smaller part of the oil pump has 7 bolts holding it. Keep the bolts organized because 2 of them are shorter than the others. And the oil pump is off. You can pause the video here if you've lost track of your bolts. This seal was leaking, so I'm replacing it. You can use the old seal as an installation tool. Be very careful to make sure the seal goes in straight. Add some assembly lube to the seal, and all the parts inside the oil pump need to be lubed too. The pulley goes on next. I made a tool to hold the pulley while I tighten the nut. Add some assembly lube to the oil pump rotor and install it on the engine. Silicone sealer will hold the rubber seal in place while I install the oil pump. If the seal tries to fall out, add more silicone. Now just install the oil pump. Start the bolts by hand and pay attention to where the short and long bolts go. These bolts get tightened to 5.9 foot-pounds. I'm using my imaginary torque wrench this time. It doesn't matter what order you tighten them, but it's a good idea to check each bolt twice. It's a good idea to prime the oil pump. I can pressurize the oil system now, so when I start the engine, I will have oil pressure right away. The oil comes into the head on the right, passes by the oil pressure switch, then goes through the camshafts. The water pump should also be replaced while the timing belt is off. I would feel silly having to redo the timing belt later if my water pump starts leaking. First, drain the coolant from the radiator. Toyota coolant is red, generic coolant is green. This is the timing belt tensioner spring. This is the timing belt tensioner pulley. This is the timing belt idler pulley. Use a 10mm socket and remove 4 bolts from the water pump. There are 3 more bolts in the water pump that are easier to reach from the wheel well. The larger bolt holds the alternator bracket. Let's take that out. Now take the water pump out. I bought the cheap timing belt kit from AutoZone. It includes all the pulleys and a new water pump and housing. You'll get more life from original Toyota parts, but I don't care because I won't be driving this car much anyway. Apply a thin coat of silicone sealer to both sides of the water pump gasket. You can install the gasket without sealer, but I want to make sure it won't leak. Now just install the water pump onto the housing. There are 3 bolts that hold it together. This is where the shorter water pump bolts go. This water pump came with the AutoZone timing belt kit and includes new studs. Install 2 nuts on the stud and tighten them against each other. Turn the outside nut clockwise to install the stud, then turn the inside nut clockwise to loosen the nuts from each other. This method of installing studs is good because you won't damage the threads and you can use a torque wrench to tighten them just right. Install the O-ring on the thermostat, then put it in the plastic thermostat housing. Add 2 nuts and tighten them to 5.9 foot-pounds. The shorter studs that came with the water pump go here. This port goes to the coolant pipe in front of the engine. Generously apply silicone sealer to the round hole in the back of the water pump and install the O-ring. You don't want this O-ring to fall out during installation. Gently move the water pump into position and start the 3 long bolts by hand. Tighten the bolts evenly, a little bit at a time. Check each bolt at least twice to make sure they are tight. The big bolt goes on the lower right corner of the water pump and holds the alternator bracket. Install the lower radiator hose and the water pump is done. You'll need to turn the engine by hand during the timing belt installation. This is much easier if the engine doesn't have any compression. Let's take the spark plugs out. Use a flathead screwdriver to pry the spark plug connectors up. Don't pull on the wires. Take the spark plug wires out. You don't need to disconnect them from the distributor cap. I'm using a 16mm deep socket with a 6-inch extension. You can also use a spark plug socket. The spark plug socket has a rubber insert that holds the plug. I don't have that, so I'm taking them out with a magnet. This is a good time to inspect the spark plugs. All my spark plugs look pretty normal. They're a beige color, meaning it's not running too rich or too lean. Now the engine is ready for a new timing belt. I'm making a little more room to work by moving the power steering pump line. Use a mirror to look through the hole in the cam gear. It's too bad that hole is too small and you can't see through it. Okay, I just used a stepper bit and drilled the hole out. Mark the 12 o'clock position and reinstall the cam gear. The valve cover is already on, so I'll need to use this tool to hold the cam gear while I tighten the bolt. That's much better. Now I can actually see. Center the hole on the mark at the top. Turn the engine over by hand until the timing mark lines up with top dead center. Follow the tooth to the left of the pin, then look at the slot to the left of that. There's a small notch in it. That's the top dead center mark. Install the timing belt idler pulley and torque the bolt. While we're here, let's check the timing belt tension spring. The manual says it should be 46 millimeters long. The old spring measures 45.53 millimeters. I guess that's good. I bought a new spring just to check, and it measures 45.50 millimeters. Clip the spring into the tensioner bracket. The tensioner pivots on a pin sticking out of the head, then the bolt goes in. Push down on the bracket with a pry bar, then tighten the bolt. This will make it so there's no belt tension. Install the timing belt around the crank pulley and oil pump and inside the idler pulley. Jam a socket below the crank pulley to hold the belt. The belt goes around the front of the water pump, then pull it tight as you install the belt on the cam gear. Hold the belt on the cam gear as you push it over the tensioner pulley. Keep holding the belt until you loosen the tensioner bolt. Now the spring will hold the belt for you. Turn the engine clockwise exactly 2 times and stop when the top dead center mark on the camshaft pulley lines up with the mark on the oil pump. Check to make sure the belt is tight and look at the mark through the cam gear hole. Okay, it's good. Now if you got it wrong, it's not a big deal. Loosen the tensioner bolt, push it down and tighten the bolt. Turn the cam gear forward or back depending on what it needs, and skip the belt over one tooth. Hold the belt on the cam gear and loosen the tensioner bolt so the spring can take up the slack. Only turn the engine clockwise. If you go the other way, the timing belt will lose tension and skip on the pulleys. Go 2 full revolutions and stop when the crankshaft is at top dead center. Check the cam gear and this time it's lined up. My timing cover was oil soaked and broken, so I replaced the lower half. I even bought the original Toyota Dust Seal. My upper cover was missing the plug. This is available from Toyota Parts Deal. Install the crankshaft pulley washer with the bend facing away from the belt, then the lower timing cover goes in. Install 4 bolts to hold it in place. I used my imaginary torque wrench here. They don't need to be crazy tight. I kept track of the short bolts and long bolts for you. Only the back bolt is long here. The harmonic balancer goes back on next. Always start bolts by hand so you don't cross-thread them. Put the car in 5th gear to make it hard for the engine to turn, then hold the wheel studs with a pry bar while you torque the crank bolt. Now go almost 2 turns clockwise, but stop at the 45 degrees before top dead center mark. This is the position where you should tension the timing belt. Make sure the tensioner bolt is loose. Then apply a little bit of pressure to the cam gear counterclockwise, but don't turn it. This will make the front of the belt tight and the tensioner spring will take up the slack on the other side. Torque the tensioner bolt to 31 foot-pounds. Turn the crankshaft just a little bit to top dead center, the 0 degree mark. Check the camshaft pulley again. It's still in the right place. Toyota says to install the upper timing cover and engine mount bracket together and juggle both parts while you bolt them on. There is a better way. Start by installing only the upper timing cover. Use 3 long bolts and 1 short bolt. The upper bolts seem like they're too long, but they're like that because the wiring harness clips into the exposed threads. Don't forget about the bolt in the back of the timing cover. Now lift the engine by the oil pan as high as it will let you. Install the bolts into the engine mount bracket, then force it past the timing cover. You might have to lift the engine a little more. Hold the bracket with one hand and be careful not to smash your fingers as you lower the engine all the way down. Now it will be easy to reach the bolts from below. I tightened them with the ratchet, but there isn't enough room for my torque wrench in here. With the harmonic balancer off, I can torque the engine mount bracket bolts. Reinstall the harmonic balancer, put the car in 5th gear, and hold the wheel studs while you torque the bolt. The top half of the motor mount is called the insulator. It insulates you from all the engine vibrations. Set it in place, then raise the engine up until the mounting bracket touches the insulator. 3 large diameter bolts hold it onto the body. A smaller bolt and a nut attach it to the bracket. Tighten the big bolts and nut to 38 foot-pounds and the smaller one goes to 27. Remember to install 1 more nut under the engine bracket. Now we don't need the jack to hold the engine. The spark plugs can go back in the car now. Add a little bit of copper anti-seize to the spark plug threads and gently set them in their holes. Tighten the spark plugs to 13 foot-pounds. That's not very tight. I've never used a torque wrench on spark plugs. That's fine. Add some dielectric grease to the spark plug wires. This will prevent the boots from getting stuck to the spark plugs. Make sure they all snap into place. Now it's time to install the alternator. Wiggle the alternator into place and install the long alternator pivot bolt. Snug it most of the way down, but leave it loose so the alternator can move while adjusting the belt. The alternator tensioner bolt pulls the alternator up to tension the belt. You can get the whole kit at AutoZone. The lower bolt threads into the alternator. Leave these bolts loose for now. Connect the power cable and don't go crazy tight on that nut. Remember to plug in the crank position sensor and AC compressor. We're almost done. Let's install the power steering fluid reservoir. Remember to reattach the metal line to the strut tower. The reservoir just snaps into place. These hoses are a tight fit, so I'm making installation easier with dielectric grease. Make sure to buy power steering or fuel hose and not vacuum or heater hose. I'm bending the metal line away from the engine to prevent the hose from kinking. The big hose is 5/8 inch inside diameter power steering return hose. The length is 25 inches. The drive belts are next. Save yourself some work and get new belts if yours are old. The power steering belt is first. Get it around the crank pulley, then the power steering pump. Pull the pump away from the engine, then use a pry bar to tension the belt. While holding the pry bar, tighten the lower bolt. You should be able to move the belt about 1/2 inch with one finger. If you got it right, tighten the other 2 bolts. If you installed a new belt, you may have to retighten it after a few drives to stop it from squealing. Drop the alternator belt down from the top and make sure it sits on the alternator pulley. Pull the belt over the crank pulley and AC compressor. Spin the belt a little to make sure it's in the grooves. Tighten the long alternator adjuster bolt until the belt feels tight. You should be able to move the belt about 1/2 inch with one finger. If it's good, use a 12mm wrench to tighten the lower bolt on the adjuster, then tighten the big pivot bolt with a 14mm wrench. Make it tight because this is also the main ground connection for the alternator. Let's get that battery back in here. The rear battery hold-down bolt is attached to the battery tray with a bracket. Install 4 bolts to hold the battery tray in place. I tighten these by hand too. Set the battery down with the positive terminal closer to the engine. You'll have to hold the front battery bolt while you install the bracket. Add 2 nuts and don't make them super tight. Install the battery terminals. Gently turn them if you need to, but never apply force to the battery. The battery terminal nuts need to be only tight enough to keep the terminals from turning. And no sparks. That's good news. The only thing left from my pile of parts is the left front wheel. My technique is just sit on the floor and hold the tire up with your feet. Always start the lug nuts by hand so you don't accidentally cross-thread them. Let's get this car back on the ground. Now I can torque those lug nuts. If the wrench doesn't turn when you're applying 80 pounds of force, you have torqued the lug nut. The power steering needs some new fluid. Fill the reservoir all the way up, then go inside the car and turn the key to unlock the steering wheel, but don't start the engine. Turn the wheel all the way left, then all the way right, several times. This will circulate power steering fluid through the pump and the rack and get the air bubbles out. I only needed to go all the way right, then left a few times. It actually works much better with the engine off. Top off the fluid, and that part is done. Finally, let's get some coolant in here. I bought pre-mixed green coolant, but if you have red Toyota coolant, you should stay with that. Now let's just start the engine so we can warm up the cooling system and get all the air out. You can get some of the air out of the system by squeezing the upper radiator hose. It took about 15 minutes for the engine to warm up on idle. It will slowly spit out air bubbles. Feel the lower radiator hose. It will get hot when the thermostat opens. Once the thermostat is open, coolant can circulate through the whole system and all the air bubbles will come out. Also check to make sure the heater is blowing hot air. That means your heater core has coolant. Okay, that's enough. Let's turn it off. Have you ever had a bad idea and just did it anyway? I didn't catch any of that coolant with my paper towel. That's good because it would have burned me anyway. Put the radiator cap back on and fill up the overflow reservoir. I'm using 50/50 pre-mixed coolant, so it's ready to go. Replacing the timing belt on the old RAV4 is not that hard, especially if you have this wrench. Now I know what you're thinking. How much does this cost? I got an estimate from the local shop for replacing the timing belt and water pump. The parts are $660 and 7 hours of labor adds up to $770. Add a bit of tax and that's $1,500. That's a lot of money. Doing it yourself is a lot cheaper. I saved a lot of money by getting my parts from AutoZone. If you drive a lot, you might want to spend a little more and get the original Toyota parts. I bought an expensive torque wrench, but you can get away without using one for the timing belt. I still had to buy a harmonic balancer puller and that mountain wrench, so we'll just budget $100 for tools. $260 total is not bad at all. Remember to check out the video description below for tools that I've used and for time links that will let you jump to the part of the video that you need. If you like this video, share it with your friends, and if you'd like to contribute to this channel more directly, follow the link below to my Patreon. Thanks for watching and take care of yourself and your RAV4.